This, Joy Division, is the most interesting new sound we've come across in the last 6 months. They're a Manchester band, with the exception of the guitarist, who comes from Salford. Very important difference. They're called Joy Division.
But I'd like to think that we don't belong to any category, you know, that the music we play sort of cuts across different things. I think, you know, we never have any intention of saying, oh, we want to sound like this or we want to sound like that. It's just what comes out.
If I had a chance, I would have a beer with Ian Curtis, or two. Because actually I think he would have been great company. Curtis wasn't the permanently gloomy, distant figure we sometimes see in Control. His life was certainly not easy, but Curtis wasn't simply some post-punk icon who embodied depression itself. Over the years, films, photographs, interviews, and the mythology surrounding Joy Division have turned him into something almost larger than life. The eternally miserable poet, dressed like an office worker staring into the darkness. But there was another Ian Curtis. He could be funny, he joked around with his friends, enjoyed music and books, and was capable of being just as silly and quirky as anyone else. His former bandmates have spoken about that side of him too, and even the recent Ian Curtis Inside exhibition brought attention to stories about his humor and the more ordinary person behind the myth. And that's what I want to talk about today. Ian Curtis as the person. A musician, a husband, a friend, a reader, and a young man trying to figure out what to do with his life.
This is the Lesser Beer YouTube channel. Here we go. Sadly, we'll never get the chance to know Curtis completely. He died at just 23 years old. By then, he had already helped create some of the most influential music of the post-punk era, while dealing with epilepsy, the pressures of Joy Division's rapidly growing success, and increasingly complicated personal circumstances.
And that's where the mythology begins. It's a common thing in history. Artists, musicians, writers, filmmakers, once they're gone, their real lives gradually become stories. Photographs become symbols, and eventually the person can disappear behind the image we've created of them. Philosopher Roland Barthes called this process myth, when something historical and complicated gets turned into a simple cultural sign. A photograph stops being just a photograph of a person and starts telling us what the person supposedly means. The individual disappears, and the symbol takes his place. The more we see the same images, Curtis in black and white, dancing on stage, looking haunted, the more those images become inseparable from our idea of who he was. Eventually, we don't need to know anything else about him, because we already have the myth. And this is also where Guy Debord's idea of the spectacle becomes useful. For Debord, modern society increasingly experiences reality through representations, images that mediate how we relate to people and events. We have the image of Curtis, the pale, serious frontman, always looking miserable, always somehow alone. But how much of that is actually Ian? And how much is the Ian Curtis we've all created? For me, Control is a perfect example. I don't mean that it's a bad movie. Quite the opposite. It's one of the best music films I've ever seen. Anton Corbijn created something beautiful, atmospheric, and incredibly powerful. And the movie played a huge role in introducing Curtis and Joy Division to a new generation. It also changed my own life. I watched Control, became fascinated by Joy Division, and ended up making a 40-minute documentary about post-punk and discovering countless obscure bands from the 1970s and 1980s. But Control is still a movie. It's an interpretation of Ian Curtis, not Ian Curtis himself. The film was based on Touching from a Distance, the memoir written by Curtis' widow, Deborah Curtis, who also served as a co-producer of the film. That makes the book incredibly important. But it also means we should remember that it's one person's perspective on a complicated relationship and a complicated man. And that's why books are so important if you want to go beyond the mythology. Touching from a Distance is probably the essential starting point. It contains details about Curtis' home life, relationships, ambitions, behavior, and the final years of his life that a 2-hour film simply can't capture. It shouldn't be treated as the final word, because if you really want to understand Ian Curtis, you have to put different memories and perspectives next to each other. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So, If you're not afraid of a few spoilers, let me show you some of the things that reveal the Ian Curtis behind the myth.
So, what was Ian Curtis actually like? Well, the first thing that surprised me while reading Deborah's book was how much Ian loved music before he was ever a musician.
He was obsessed with David Bowie in particular. He even managed to get into Bowie's dressing room and collect his autographs, along with a broken drumstick and a spare guitar string. Ian wanted to become part of that world. He was ambitious, romantic, and perhaps slightly delusional. Ian Curtis also loved clothes. Deborah describes how he could be obsessed over a particular item for weeks. Once he became fixated on a tiger print scarf in a shop window. He couldn't afford it, so he kept returning to check whether it was still there. Curtis was a generous young man. One evening, Deborah remembers them walking through Manchester when Ian was eating a hot beef pie. He spotted a homeless man sitting on a bench, stopped, and handed him the pie, barely having finished the bite in his mouth. And people who knew him when he was young remembered something similar. But then there was the other Ian. Sometimes he could be incredibly stubborn, jealous, and self-centered, and he could suddenly explode in anger. Deborah describes one day when Ian started making racist comments while eating at an Indian restaurant. On another occasion, he smashed his food through a glass door. Curtis also loved books. Deborah remembers Ian reading The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde aloud. As he reached the end, his voice began to crack, and he started crying. That detail really matters. I also love how Joy Division could be absolute idiots together. They covered buses in shaving foam while touring, released mice, threw eggs, and played increasingly ridiculous practical jokes. And Ian himself had a strange fear of foam rubber, so naturally, the others loved dropping pieces of it down the back of his neck. But when Deborah came home to find the living room covered in foam after a piece of furniture had been ruined, Ian got down on his hands and knees and cleaned the whole thing up. Then he went out and brought her a box of chocolates.
And perhaps one of the most revealing things about him is that he wasn't nearly as detached from ordinary life as the mythology suggests. He had ambitions that were sometimes ridiculous.
As a teenager, he once seriously considered becoming a stuntman and jumped from the roof of a garage onto a homemade wooden landing pad while local children watched. Later, he wanted to leave the band and join a circus. And here is another detail that I find fascinating. Before joining Joy Division, Curtis worked as an assistant disablement resettlement officer for the Manpower Services Commission in Manchester and Macclesfield, helping people with disabilities find suitable employment. Ian Curtis is often remembered as the mysterious, tortured frontman of Joy Division. But Peter Hook's book, Unknown Pleasures, Inside Joy Division, reveals a much more complicated person. They met at the Sex Pistols concert at Manchester's Electric Circus in 1976.
He had hate written on his jacket in orange fluorescent paint. I liked him straight away, Hook said.
He was just a kid with hate on his coat. Just a normal kid. Of course, we were all punks, so we must have looked pretty well compared to everybody else, but he looked normal compared to us. He was nice, softly spoken, sharp sense of humor. Of the two portrayals of him on film, I prefer the one in 24-Hour Party People. The guy in Control, Sam Riley, played him as being much more arty and conventionally pretty, whereas Sean Harris in 24-Hour Party People had a bit more of the real-life Ian's edginess and intensity. Ian Curtis could go mad, as Hook remembers from one of Joy Division's early concerts. While the band were kept waiting to go on, Ian had been knocking back beers and eventually got completely drunk. A few songs into the set, he jumped off the stage and began overturning tables, smashing glasses and sending broken furniture flying across the dance floor. At one point, he threw himself into the broken glass and cut himself. The band could only watch in disbelief as their seemingly quiet friend completely lost control. It ended up being one of their worst gigs. Speaking about his own and Curtis' political views, Hook just mentioned that they all liked history because they were raised in post-war Britain, but they've never been right-wing or so. When Ian began his relationship with Honoré, the other members of the group were jealous. They were stuck in cheap accommodations while Ian was able to spend time with Anik, going out to galleries and exhibitions. Hook describes Curtis as having a poor grasp of money and practical matters. He had a wife, a child, and increasingly serious responsibilities, but he was still trying to live like a young musician who could simply follow whatever impulse seemed right at the time. And beneath the jokes, Hook gradually began to see something much darker. By January 1979, he had been officially diagnosed with epilepsy, and the seizures became an increasingly important part of the band's life.
Ian's epilepsy changed him. As Hook remembers, he became quieter, more withdrawn, and less inclined to laugh. He was also taking barbiturates for his epilepsy, which had a numbing, deadening effect.
Yet, even as his condition deteriorated, Ian remained ambitious. Joy Division were becoming successful. Unknown Pleasures was being released. Ian appeared on the cover of Enemy. But Hook remembers that none of them really felt like stars. That contrast is perhaps the most tragic thing about Hook's portrait of Ian Curtis. On stage, Ian looked like someone who had completely escaped ordinary life, and Hook's memories remind us that before Ian Curtis became a myth, he was their mate. They annoyed him, they played stupid jokes on him. Only later, after his death, would Peter Hook look back at those moments and realize just how much had been happening beneath the surface. As Hook said, Ian wasn't constantly brooding or detached from reality. He could laugh at the same stupid things as everyone else and was simply one of the lads. At the same time, Hook writes that Ian was struggling to balance his life as a husband and father with his desire to be on the road with the band. The public got increasingly confident in Ian. Debbie often got the exhausted, troubled side of him. Was he more himself when he was with Anik, or more himself when he was pissing about with us? Said Hook. I bet even Ian didn't know who the real Ian was. At just 24, Hook and the other members struggled to process Ian's sudden death in 1980. They spent days together in stunned silence, drinking, playing darts, and trying to make sense of what had happened. Hook and Bernard even chose not to see Ian's body, retreating to the pub instead. At the funeral, Peter felt detached and numb. As he later admitted, they never really knew how to grieve properly. They were simply too young and too shocked to process it. Now we know how Ian Curtis was remembered by his wife and by the members of Joy Division. But to understand the man behind the myth, it is also worth hearing from the woman who was closest to him during the final months of his life, his lover, Belgian journalist Anik Honoré. She remembers him as a gentle, shy, and deeply vulnerable. On stage, he seemed to become a completely different person, intense and almost possessed, but afterwards he would return to being a quiet, exhausted young man full of doubts about his life and the future of Joy Division.
She believed Ian was overwhelmed by his own talent and increasingly vulnerable because of his epilepsy and medication.
She also insisted that their relationship was purely platonic, describing it as a deeply emotional but non-physical connection. Most importantly, Anik rejected the idea that Ian's death was the inevitable result of their relationship. She believed it was a pure moment of madness, especially considering that he had seemed excited about the upcoming American tour only days before his death. And even the recent Ian Curtis Inside exhibition in New York offered glimpses of the person behind the myth. Stephen Morris recalled Curtis' sense of humor and the lighter side of Joy Division's early days. He remembered Ian as a regular lad who told terrible jokes and was often smiling, a far cry from the familiar image of Curtis sitting with his head in his hands. So, this is who Ian Curtis was and how he was remembered by the people who knew him. Maybe the next time you listen to Joy Division or watch Control, you'll keep this hidden side of Curtis in mind.
Thank you for watching, subscribe to my TikTok and Instagram, and I'll see you next time.